Hi guys, welcome to Paul's Photography Basics, and well, I'm Paul. Today I want to talk about sharpness. You are probably one of the many photographers who chase sharpness. If you aren't one of them, then good for you. I mean, you figured something out. But you'd be surprised how many photographers in today's world chase this. It's our number one nemesis. We can't get our images as sharp as we want them to be, and we can't figure out why. So I'm here to talk about this issue, and I have narrowed this down to what I believe are the 7 biggest reasons that we struggle to get sharp pictures. So let's dive in. Number 7, you have a bad lens. You just don't have a good lens. Your lens needs to be replaced. You need to buy a lens that does better, right? Now, I have that at the very bottom of the list for a reason. A lot of people put that at the top of the list. They have unsharp images, and so they chase this. I think if I get a better lens, my pictures will be sharper. And maybe they will, right? Even if you are doing other things wrong, which I think maybe might be the issue in the first place. Rarely is the real problem the lens itself, but occasionally it can be. So if you have a low-grade lens, you have a $200 or a $400 lens, and you replace it with a $2,000 lens, you might see an edge of sharpness increase, but you may also struggle still with, even though you got an improvement out of this higher-priced lens, you didn't get what you were hoping for, because that might not be the problem in the first place. Now, are there differences between a $200 lens and a $2,000 lens as far as sharpness? Well, of course there are. I'd be silly to say there aren't. But it may not be the huge delta you believe it is. Even the cheap little kit lens, the little 18 to 55, the pariah of lenses, that lens, when used properly, can generally produce some pretty sharp images. Now, is the $2,000 lens going to have better glass? Is it going to have better coatings? And these things really come into play if you have backlit situations and things like that. That's important, right? So I'm not suggesting that you don't invest in good glass. That is always a wise investment. But if you're chasing this issue, that may not be your fix. I think you need to look at the other things before you go out and you run out and you buy a new lens to solve this problem. There are a few lenses that simply aren't very sharp, but there's not many of them. Not in today's world. Even the lower price lenses are pretty good today. So, what comes next? Well, maybe your lens needs to be calibrated. So this is number 6. Oops, 6. Boom. Maybe your lens needs to be calibrated. What's that mean? Well, if you have, this is a misnomer to some degree. If you have a little bit higher end camera, so something, say in the Nikon, oh, and by the way, we're talking about DSLRs, not mirrorless. If you have mirrorless cameras, you don't need to have your lenses calibrated. But if you have a DSLR, and we're talking in the Nikon world, 7000 series or above, the 3000 and the 5000 series do not have lens calibration capabilities. In the Canon lineup, something double digit or higher, single digit, so excluding like the Rebel series. The calibration is actually done in the body. It's actually a body calibration, not a lens calibration, although that's what it's called. What you're doing is you're telling the camera that when you mount this lens, instead of focusing at this point, focus a little deeper or focus a little shallower. Because I seem to, when I focus here, my pictures are always sharp behind it, or they're always sharp in front of it. That's really the edge of sharpness. So I can micro adjust that lens to focus slightly in front or slightly behind where it had been focusing. And it is lens specific. So when you put a different lens on, it doesn't have that same change, although most of the cameras have the capability of doing a global adjustment if everything is off. But generally, you'll find one lens that, my 24 to 70 just isn't as sharp as it should be. Well, maybe it needs to be calibrated. So that's number 6. Number 5 is, I believe we're getting a little higher on the list here. We're getting into more likely reasons your images aren't sharp. Number 5 is shallow depth of field. Now we're all looking, or most of us are looking, for that beautiful bokeh in the background, right? We want that shallow depth of field where the background is just blurred out, it's all gone. And of course, that's a beautiful look. Who doesn't want that? But do we want that at a sacrifice of the quality of our image in the first place? And of course, the answer is no, right? But you'd be surprised how many photographers go out and they'll buy a 1.8 or a 1.4 or even a 1.2 aperture lens, and they'll use it at that 1.2 or the 1.4 to get that shallowest depth of field they can. But that can bite you, because when you're open that lens wide open like that, you have very, very shallow depth of field. I mean, we're talking paper thin depth of field. And as such, what happens is you just don't have enough sharpness in your image to get from the nose to the ears, to the eyes. You don't have all that sharp. And then you look at your picture and you're like, they're not sharp. Well, there's probably a paper thin line in there that's tack sharp, but it's just not enough to cover a whole face or cover whatever. Because when we're chasing that shallow depth of field to get the background blur, well, we might be overdoing it. So I'm going to encourage you to try your lens. And I think everybody should test their lenses and test, go out with a model, go out with a subject that, in a distance away that you typically shoot your subjects, right? Put them at 10 feet away or whatever. And literally test your lens at different apertures. And what you'll find is that, if you stop that lens down to f2 or 2.8, f4, off that ultimate, that wide open aperture, you may gain enough depth of field that your images become sharp enough that you like them without sacrificing all that much in the background. You might be surprised that f4 or f2.8 does not gain the sharpness in the background that you might think it would compared to the 1.4. Will it be a little sharper? Of course it will, right? This dovetails into number 4. And number 4 is not finding the sweet spot of your lens. So when you're shooting your lens at 1.4 or 1.2 or 1.8, whatever it is, f2, what you may find is that in addition to the fact that you are not giving yourself enough depth of field in the first place, your paper thin depth of field is biting you, you may be surprised to learn that lens you're using is not truly sharp there in the first place. Most lenses, in fact, I think most is a misnomer. Very, very, very few, probably a handful of lenses made, are truly, absolutely at their sharpest when they're wide open. Once you stop it down a stop and a half, 2 stops, 2.5 stops from its maximum aperture, is where most lenses find their absolute sweet spot. That is where they are at their sharpest. I encourage you to test your lens. Go out and look up your lens and do some Google research and see if anybody out there's probably somebody who's done a video on your particular lens in the sweet spot. But you might find out that it's like, I've been shooting my lens at this aperture, and I realize everybody's saying, if I stop it down to here, I'll love it. And so I encourage you to test your own lenses, or do at least minimally do some research to find, if anybody else has done it for you, that sweet spot on your lens. And keep in mind too that not only every version, but every sample of a lens, right? I might have the same lens as you have, but my copy simply isn't the same as your copy. Now, they're probably going to be pretty close, but one person might find that their sweet spot is a little different than another sweet spot. But in any case, you really owe it to yourself to find that sweet spot of your lens. It will pay dividends, I promise you. this kind of, on a sidebar over here, go practice with your equipment. It amazes me how many photographers don't actually go out and practice and practice and practice and test and do, shoot it here, do this, do that. It amazes me how many photographers, all they do is they go out on their jobs, their assignments, their shoots, they shoot with the camera, and then they come back and they find out they don't like the results. And that's probably not a really solid way of doing things. And I'm not trying to condemn anybody, but let's face it, we probably all could use the extra practice. Okay, so list is getting a little shorter. That brings us up to number 3. Now 3 is probably one of the most complex ones here. 3 is that you are either misunderstanding, and there's a lot of this, believe me, and I've been guilty myself, misunderstanding how your focus system works, and or simply misusing it. And usually if you're misusing it, it's actually ties back into the first part where maybe you misunderstand how the whole system works in the first place. So, I'll have people all the time at the camera store and things like that. They'll talk to me about how they're using their focus system, and come to find out, I was like, well, I asked them, why would you do that? And I said, well, I watched a YouTube video, or I didn't know any better, and I said it this way, and I've been using it since I got the camera, or whatever. You need to learn the difference between what continuous focus and single focus are. A lot of people don't realize that in continuous focus, and by the way, if you're on a Canon camera, this is servo. So servo calls continuous focus servo, and they call single focus one shot. So one shot or single versus continuous or servo. And in servo or in continuous, what you can actually take out of focus pictures. Your camera, this is designed for fast moving subjects where you need the camera to be super responsive to the shutter button, and as such, it frees up the focus lock mechanism. So in single focus, in your focus modes, when you press the shutter button, it might delay it by a fraction of a second in order to get a solid focus lock, to confirm that it has a solid focus lock, because it's designed for non-moving subjects. When you shoot in continuous focus, so this is not your drive mode, this is the focus mode on your camera. When you're in continuous, the camera is expecting there to be movement in your subject, and as such, you're kind of telling the camera, hey, don't take that extra fraction of the second to, when I press the shutter button, confirm focus lock. Of course, try to get focus, right? But go ahead and take the picture when I press the button. So if you're using one of the mirrorless cameras and you're using tracking mode for face and eye, things like that, well, now servo or continuous mode probably makes sense to use. But if you're just shooting portraits under normal circumstances with your DSLR, I would say you probably need to be in single focus mode. Then we have our focus areas, right? Our focus points. And are we using those wisely and accurately? So the most accurate focusing you're ever going to do is going to be using a single spot, right? Single point autofocus, and putting it directly on the part of the subject that you want to focus on, or on the subject you want to focus on. That is how you will achieve the most accurate focusing. But be aware, a little bit of camera movement once you've got that focus lock will now throw it out because it has locked. So you need to be really careful about how you focus lock. The other part of this is that I believe, and I've seen evidence, where people will tell me, they'll take a picture like this, right? And they'll say, I focused on the eyeball. Well, no, you didn't. You didn't focus on the eye. You might think you focused on the eye, but you really couldn't have, because the focus area of the camera, even though it's a single point, when we talk about single point, we're not talking about single pixel. That's just this area versus this area versus this area, right? And so that area might have encompassed the eye, but unless you're super close to the subject, which this picture obviously is not, you are not focusing necessarily on the eye. You might be focusing on the face of some sort, but when enlarged, you might get to a point where it's like, well, the cheek is sharp, but the eye isn't. Well, that's because the camera is going to likely grab the nose or the cheek before it grabs the eye, unless, again, you're using one of the cool new cameras that have eye detection, and if that's the case, it probably did focus on the eye. But in general terms, there's a good probability it grabbed the cheek or the nose rather than the eye, because autofocus systems will generally focus on what is closest to you. And it is not a single pinpoint. It's just basically an area. It's a group of pixels, right? It is not a single pixel. So, as such, you may not be actually focusing on exactly what you think you're focusing on. Which brings us to our big number 2. What is number 2? I got to tell you, I debated whether number 2 should actually be number 1. I really had to weigh this out, but since number 1 is truly a technique issue, I went ahead and put number 1 as number 1 and left this one as number 2. But number 2 is that you have unrealistic expectations. Now, I know that sounds bad, and I know it's like, well, my camera should do this, and I've seen my camera do this, and yada, yada, yada. I get it. We all have. But are our expectations truly realistic? Should I be, and guess what, guys? We are all, and I'm not saying that I'm not guilty of this. We are all pixel peepers. Now, on my computer system here, right? When I am looking at pictures, when I'm culling through pictures, I do it in full screen. So on my monitor, I'm looking at, I measured it one day. I'm looking at an image that's 20 inches wide by 13 inches tall. I'm almost looking at a 16 by 20 image before I magnify it. Before I start looking to see if it's sharp enough. I'm already looking at a huge picture before I look at it to see if it's sharp enough. We do this, guys. And again, with that same, I have this picture, right? I have this picture, and, this one doesn't actually have a person in the window, but we're just going to say it does, right? In the window up here, I enlarged it, and I don't think this guy's face is as sharp as it should be. Really? How many pixels are we really using on a tiny, tiny bit of our sensor? Do the math sometime. You have a 24 or 30 or 36, 45, whatever megapixel sensor, right? But if you divide that up into little tiny pieces, does that portion that you're looking at represent even 1 megapixel? Is it a half a megapixel? A tenth of a megapixel? So, put that in perspective. If I shot if I'm magnifying to a point, then I'm only looking at a small piece of the image, and then I say, well, I don't think the eye is as sharp as it should be. How many pixels does that portion of the image, how many pixels are actually represented there? If you got a lot closer to your subject, you would probably find that you have much more sharpness because, well, you have more pixels to represent that portion of the image. So I think that we are often very unrealistic about our expectations. Plain and simple. We just think that we should be able to magnify and magnify and magnify and see the finest detail in an image. And I just don't think that's practical. And I have to add something here. And this is just kind of a sidebar again. But, when you're shooting, if you're shooting for friends or for clients or for just to put out onto social media, there's a real good probability that the people looking at your images, in fact, it's not even a real good probability, it's almost a certainty, that the people looking at your images are not looking at your images based on, are they tack sharp? Can I enlarge my picture of my kid to the point that I can see his eyebrows? They're not doing that, guys. We're the only ones doing it. And then we're driving ourselves nuts trying to achieve this level of perfection in our images that just doesn't need to happen, in my opinion. Because again, when I'm looking at that picture as almost a 16 by 20, basically a 16 by 20 image, right in front of me, by the way, right? I mean, it's a foot and a half, 2 feet away from me when I'm sitting here at my desk. When I'm looking at that big, how is your customer going to do that? Is your client going to do that? Is your friend? The only time when I'm scrolling through social media and things like that, the only time I really magnify to see that level of detail is when I'm in one of my groups or something and somebody has posted something about sharpness and I'm enlarging it to see if I can help them chase this sharpness issue. So talk yourself in off the ledge. Be realistic about your expectations about how sharp things should be in the first place, and I think you'll be happier. Now, that brings us to the number one cause of unsharp images. And haven't I listed everything already? I mean, it's like I've listed low-grade glass, and I've listed lens calibration, I've listed, shallow depth of field, and not finding the sweet spot, and misunderstanding the focus system and unrealistic expectations. What have I left out? I've left out something that really has zero to do, believe it or not, with focus. What? I thought this was about focus, right? This is about sharp images. And sharp images aren't just about focus, guys. Sharp images, also there's another factor here. And that's, do you have camera movement in your images? We get sloppy. We all get sloppy. Some of us start out sloppy. Maybe we never were properly educated, properly trained on how to correctly hold a camera, how to exhale gently and to press the shutter button slowly. Maybe we never learned that in the first place. We've got a death grip on our camera with our right hand and we're pressing the button and shaking the camera all over the place in the first place. Or maybe we've just gotten sloppy. Baseball players, right now, they're going to spring training, right? They're going to spring training. Aren't these professional baseball players? Don't they do this for a living? Why do they need to spring training? Sometimes you'll hear a manager of a football team, basketball team, whatever, say, we're getting back to the basics. We all get sloppy. The more experience you have, the easier it is to get sloppy because you kind of rest on your laurels. I encourage you to really think about what you're doing, how you're holding the camera, your shutter speeds, etc. Do not rely on IBIS. Do not rely on in-body stabilization or lens, in-lens stabilization to correct your mistakes. That's poor insurance. Try to get your skill set to a point where you're constantly holding the camera right, you're slowing down a little bit maybe when you're shooting, you're keeping your shutter speed high enough. Work on a monopod, work on a tripod. Now, when I say keeping your shutter speed high enough, I'm going to blow away everything you've probably read, heard, been trained, been taught, because I learned from the very start, right? I've been doing this a long time, and I learned from the very start, you keep your shutter speed above a 60th if you're hand holding the camera. I just watched a video this morning that, and I'm not going to call the guy out, but I think he's wrong, right? That he used this analogy of this old kind of match the shutter speed to the focal length of your lens. You've probably heard that. You've probably read it, whatever, where you make sure that the shutter speed is at least the focal length of your lens. And then he followed that. He went on to say, which means if I'm using a 16 millimeter lens, I can shoot at a 16th of a second. What? Don't try that, guys. Might you pull it off? Maybe. Especially with, stabilization in your lens and maybe in-body stabilization if your camera has it. But don't try that. I encourage you to not try that. Or maybe you should, so you learn that you shouldn't do that. Whatever the case, I don't even go by the keep it at a 60th anymore. I don't adhere to the you need to keep your shutter speed at the focal length of your lens anymore. So if I'm using a 100 millimeter lens, you need to be at least 100th of a second. Or if I'm using a 200 millimeter lens, I need to be at a 200th of a second. Those kind of rules, if you will, that rule of thumb, those were developed way back in the film days where, one, we were taking much more time with our cameras. They were bigger, they were heavier, we were manually focusing, everything was kind of slowed down. We weren't, running and gunning and shooting in a hurry. That's one part of this formula. The other part of the formula is we weren't in those days over magnifying. We weren't what I just talked about, right? We weren't looking at big images all the time. We printed 4x5 and 5x5 proof prints, and then some of these would end up being 8x10s, maybe occasionally 11x14 or 16x20. But most of the images were never printed larger than 8x10. So when I'm looking at a smaller image, I might not see that camera movement. It might look fine. But with that being said, now we enlarge more. So I'm going to suggest you consider a new way of thinking about shooting. And I'm almost guaranteeing, there's really no way I can guarantee this, but I'm almost guaranteeing that you will see an improvement in your sharpness if you adopt a new philosophy that instead of matching the shutter speed to the focal length of your lens, that you at least triple the focal length of your lens with your shutter speed. Now, in the past, that wasn't always as easy because we didn't have cameras that performed at the ISOs, the ones that they do and stuff. But so that means I'm no longer trying to handhold my 70 to 200 at a 200 or 250th of a second. Keep your shutter speeds high. It will pay dividends in sharpness. I truly believe that most people are chasing camera movement when they're chasing the sharpness issue, and they'll throw money at lenses, and they'll have their lenses calibrated, and they'll do all of this other stuff, but they're shooting at low shutter speeds where they're just getting enough camera movement to take the edge of sharpness off of everything. Try that. Let me know how it turns out. Thanks for watching. Come back, subscribe, all that stuff. Thanks. See you next time.